Welcome to tonight's story. As you get cozy, let your mind drift to a quiet, enchanted world where mysteries unfold. Picture a hidden river, deep in a forgotten forest, where whispers of the future ripple in the water. Our journey begins with Arlen, a traveler seeking truth. Let this peaceful tale guide you gently into sleep. In the depths of the forgotten world, where even the sky seemed to wear a veil of secrets, there was a tale whispered only by those who knew how to listen. It spoke of an enchanted river, hidden far beyond the borders of what was known, where the waters shimmered not with the reflection of the present, but with glimpses of the future. The river's path, they said, was guarded, by whom none could say for certain, but those who sought its waters were tested. Most never returned, their fates swallowed by the forest that surrounded the river's source. Arlen had heard the tale many times as a child, in the dim glow of the hearth, where old men told stories to pass the long nights. His mind would wander then, carried by the images of a river that could reveal the unknown, the uncharted. But the tale was more than a child's fancy. It had always been a whisper in his mind, a pull he couldn't explain. As the years passed and the weight of life pressed upon him, the whisper grew louder, until it was no longer a mere tale. It was a call. The call had brought him here, to the edge of the haunted forest, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches beckoning him into the shadows. The path before him was narrow, marked only by stones that had long since been overtaken by moss and creeping ivy. Arlen hesitated for a moment, staring into the darkness beyond, where no sun or star could pierce. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and ancient secrets. He had been warned. This was no journey for the faint-hearted. But Arlen was not faint-hearted. He had left behind the world he knew, the comforts of a life that no longer held meaning, all for the chance to see what lay ahead of him. The future had become an enigma he was desperate to unravel, and if the enchanted river could show him the way, he would find it, no matter the cost. As he stepped onto the path, the stones beneath his feet seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The deeper he ventured into the forest, the more the world behind him faded. The sounds of the outside, birds, wind, even the rustle of leaves, vanished, replaced by a silence so thick it felt alive. Every step he took was a step into the unknown. Time, too, seemed to lose its grip on him. Hours could have passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. The trees blurred into shadows, their gnarled limbs twisting like the fingers of forgotten gods. Yet Arlen did not falter. His mind was clear, his heart steady. There was only one goal before him, the river. But as the silence pressed in around him, Arlen began to feel the weight of another presence. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a sensation that he was not alone. His steps slowed, his senses heightening. The whisper that had led him here was now distant, almost drowned by the presence that seemed to watch him from every angle. He turned, eyes scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling lingered. He was being followed. Arlen's breath quickened, though he tried to calm himself. Fear had no place here, not when he was so close. The river was near. He could feel it in the stillness, in the way the earth beneath his feet seemed to guide him. And yet, something, or someone, was watching. Perhaps it was the dragon, the fabled guardian of the river, testing him already. Though no word had been spoken, no challenge issued, he pressed on, refusing to yield to the weight of the unseen gaze. The path twisted sharply, and before him, through a break in the trees, he caught the first glimpse of it, the river. A silver thread cutting through the darkened landscape, glowing faintly in the twilight. Arlen's heart surged with hope. But as he approached, the air grew colder, and the whisper, the one that had called him for so long, faded completely. The presence he had felt was no longer distant. It was near, closer than it had ever been. And Arlen knew, without seeing, that the test had begun. The river gleamed before him, a shimmering ribbon of silver in the fading twilight. Its surface was smooth, too smooth, as though untouched by the natural world. The air here felt strange, heavier somehow, and with every breath Arlen took, the sense of being watched deepened. Though his eyes saw nothing but the river and the shadows of the ancient trees that hemmed its banks, his instincts whispered that he was not alone. He knelt by the water's edge, cautious but compelled. There was no sound, not the gentle ripple of water, not the wind through the branches. The river was unnervingly still. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing the surface, expecting to feel the cold kiss of water. But it was warmer than he had anticipated, as though the river itself pulsed with life, with a power that went far beyond anything natural. His heart quickened, and then a tremor. The earth beneath his feet quivered, a faint but undeniable shift, as if the ground itself were warning him. Arlen rose to his feet, the hairs on his arms standing on end. He turned slowly, his eyes searching the shadows, and there, within the veil of the forest, something moved, silent, yet unmistakably real. His pulse pounded in his ears, but still he saw nothing clearly. Only the vague impression of scales glinting in the dim light, and eyes that watched with an intensity that froze his breath in his throat. The dragon. A tremor ran through the earth again, stronger this time, and from the shadows emerged the creature whose legend had haunted the minds of travelers for centuries. It was not the kind of beast that Arlen had imagined in his childhood stories. This dragon was neither a monster nor a majestic figure of might. It was something in between, a creature of shadows and light, its black scales gleaming like whetstones, its eyes burning gold. Its body moved with an unnatural grace, serpentine and silent, its wings folded against its massive frame. But it did not strike, it merely watched. Arlen's breath came in shallow gasps as he forced himself to hold the dragon's gaze. The creature was far larger than anything he had ever encountered, yet there was no threat in its eyes, only an ancient, watchful intelligence. A test, he thought. This was the first test. The dragon circled the edge of the clearing, its tail sweeping the ground in slow, deliberate arcs. As it moved, the light around them seemed to dim, the air thickening with a presence that weighed on Arlen's chest. He could feel the creature's power, not in its size or its strength, but in the way it seemed to bend the very world around it. The dragon was in control of everything here. The river, the forest, and now Arlen himself. Finally, the dragon spoke, though its mouth did not move. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a deep rumble that resonated through the ground beneath Arlen's feet, vibrating in his bones. "Why have you come?" it asked. The question hung in the air like smoke, wrapping itself around Arlen's mind. He had prepared for this moment, or so he thought. He had journeyed through the forest, endured its terrors, and reached the river. But standing here before the creature of legend, he felt the weight of his reason falter. The whisper that had called him here was now silent, and for a moment he doubted everything. Why had he come? "To see my future," he said, his voice trembling in the thick air. "I seek the truth of what is to come." The dragon's eyes narrowed, the gold within them shifting like molten metal. "The truth?" it echoed, its tone dripping with something akin to amusement. "What makes you think the future is truth? What you seek is not the future. It is certainty, and certainty is an illusion." Arlen swallowed hard. "But the river reveals only what it chooses to show," the dragon interrupted, stepping closer. Its massive form cast a shadow over the water, and the temperature around Arlen dropped, though he could feel the heat of the dragon's breath. "It offers no promises, no guarantees. What you see will depend on the strength of your will. But first, you must prove you are worthy of even a glimpse." The dragon's gaze bore into him, and Arlen's body tensed as he realized the test was no longer theoretical. His heart thundered in his chest as the creature's voice filled his mind again. "Do you truly seek the future? Or do you merely seek to escape the past?" it asked. Its voice a low growl, filled with an ancient challenge. "You will face your fears here, traveler. The river will show you nothing if you are ruled by them." The air around them grew thick with tension, and Arlen's mind whirled with doubt. Was he truly ready for this? The dragon's words echoed in his mind, and he felt the presence of something deeper at play. This was not just a quest for the future. It was a battle against the shadows of his own soul. The dragon's eyes glinted with a knowing gleam, and Arlen knew the real test had only just begun. The dragon's words lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge, sinking deep into Arlen's mind. The river, once so tantalizingly close, now seemed distant, obscured by the weight of his own doubts. He had come for answers, for visions of the future, but the creature before him demanded something more than simple desire. The dragon's presence pressed down on him, ancient and inscrutable. And Arlen knew that to see the river's secrets, he would have to face what he feared most. The ground beneath him trembled again, and the world shifted. The trees that had loomed at the edges of the clearing faded into mist, dissolving into shadows, and the once still river swirled with strange, dark currents. The dragon's molten eyes never wavered, watching Arlen with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He felt the first stirrings of fear in his chest, but he pushed them down. There was no turning back now. The trial of fear, the dragon's voice echoed in his mind, low and distant. Your journey has brought you here, to the edge of the unknown. But before the river can show you its truths, you must confront your deepest fears. Only then will you be ready. Arlen's breath quickened, and as he looked around, the air itself seemed to warp, bending reality into something strange and foreign. Shadows stretched longer than they should, and the mist coiled at his feet, rising in thin tendrils that wrapped around him like the grasp of unseen hands. In the distance, he could hear a faint sound, a whisper, too soft to understand, yet too close to ignore. His heart pounded harder. The mist thickened, and before him, the landscape twisted. The ground became unfamiliar, the air colder. The river vanished from sight, swallowed by the shadows that now surged around him. He blinked, and the clearing was gone, replaced by a vision that filled him with dread. He was standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind howling in his ears, a dark chasm yawning beneath him. The void below was endless, an abyss that seemed to pull at him, threatening to drag him down. Arlen took a step back, but the ground crumbled beneath his feet, and he stumbled, nearly losing his balance. His heart raced, panic clawing at the edges of his mind. The dragon's voice whispered again, though the creature itself was nowhere to be seen. What do you fear, traveller? Is it the unknown that terrifies you? Or is it something deeper, something that lurks within? Arlen's chest tightened, and he realized with a cold clarity that this vision, the cliff, the abyss, was no random illusion. It was his fear, a fear he had buried deep within himself. The fear of falling, of losing control, of being swallowed by forces beyond his understanding. He had felt it before, in the quiet moments when doubt crept into his thoughts, when the weight of uncertainty became too much to bear. The wind howled again, louder now, and Arlen could feel the pull of the abyss growing stronger. beckoning him to step closer, to fall into its depths. His legs trembled, and for a moment he felt himself slipping. The edges of the cliff were crumbling, the ground beneath him giving way. He tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. The abyss was everywhere. "You cannot run from your fear," the dragon's voice echoed. "Face it! Only then will you pass this trial." Arlen's breath came in ragged gasps. He wanted to retreat, to turn and flee from the abyss that threatened to consume him. But the dragon's words weighed heavy in his mind. Running would not save him. The only way forward was through the fear. With a trembling hand, Arlen took a step forward, his feet precariously balanced on the edge of the cliff. His heart thundered in his chest, but he did not stop. Another step, and the ground shifted beneath him again, threatening to collapse. The abyss seemed to reach up for him, and for a moment he teetered on the brink of falling. But then something shifted. The fear that had gripped him so tightly loosened its hold, and a strange calm washed over him. He stood at the edge of the abyss, staring down into the void, but it no longer held the same power over him. It was not the fear itself that had to be conquered. It was the choice to face it, to acknowledge its presence and step forward anyway. Arlen exhaled slowly, and the wind around him began to still. The ground beneath his feet solidified, and the abyss that had seemed so vast and threatening faded, dissolving into mist. The vision ebbed away, leaving him standing once again by the river. The dragon's molten eyes still watching, but now with a glint of approval. "You have passed the first test," the dragon said, its voice low and rumbling. "But the journey is far from over. The river has yet to reveal its secrets, and more trials await." Arlen nodded, his breath still unsteady, but his resolve strengthened. He had faced the fear within himself, and though the shadows of the unknown still loomed ahead, he knew now that he could confront whatever came next. The dragon shifted its great wings, casting a shadow over the river once more. "You may proceed, but be warned. The next trial will not be so forgiving." The river rippled before him now, its silver surface shimmering in the low light, inviting but deceptive. The air was thick with the residue of the trial he had just endured, the sense of unease still clinging to his skin. Yet, something had shifted in the atmosphere. The dragon remained silent, watching, its molten eyes gleaming with the wisdom of ages. Arlen knew that his trials were far from over, and though the abyss of fear had receded, something far more insidious awaited him. The trial of illusion. He approached the river cautiously, the ground beneath his feet soft, as if the very earth itself was hesitant to hold him. The river had an unnatural stillness, as though it held its breath, waiting for him to touch it. He knelt by the water's edge, drawn in by the way the light played across the surface, flickering and shifting in patterns too intricate for his mind to fully grasp. Arlen reached out again, his fingertips brushing the surface. This time, the water was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth he had felt before. The moment his fingers touched the river, the world around him began to shift. The water no longer reflected the dark sky or the shadows of the trees. Instead, it showed something else, something impossible. His breath caught as he stared into the depths, watching as the rippling surface revealed visions not of his future, but of something far more seductive. The river had become a mirror. His own face stared back at him, but it wasn't the man he knew. It was a version of himself that gleamed with success, with certainty. His eyes shone with purpose, his expression confident, every line of his face untroubled by doubt. Behind him, the vision unfolded. A life filled with triumph, with everything he had ever wanted. Wealth, power, love. It was all there, just beyond the veil of the water. But Arlen knew better. He had been warned. The trial of illusion, he whispered to himself, his voice low, as though saying the words out loud would somehow protect him from the power the river held. Yet, the temptation was undeniable. The reflection in the water was more than just a vision. It was a promise, one that tugged at his very soul. Everything he had ever longed for was within reach, if only he could believe in what he saw. The river's surface shimmered again, and the image shifted. Now he saw himself standing on a throne, crowned in gold, surrounded by those who revered him. He was a king, his kingdom vast and his power unmatched. It was the life he had dreamed of, a future that seemed so real, so tangible, that for a moment he forgot where he was. He forgot the dragon, the trials, the purpose of his journey. All that mattered was the vision before him, the life that could be his. But as he leaned closer, the water rippled and the image changed once more. This time, it was not a vision of power or glory, but of love. A woman stood beside him, her hand in his, her face glowing with a warmth that made his heart ache. She was someone he had never met, and yet in this moment, he felt as though he had known her all his life. The connection was instant, undeniable, and he wanted nothing more than to reach through the water, to touch the life that waited for him on the other side. His hand hovered over the surface, trembling. The dragon's words echoed faintly in his mind. The river reveals only what it chooses to show. What you see will depend on the strength of your will. Arlen blinked, the haze of the illusion flickering for a moment. He tore his gaze away from the water, the weight of the dragon's warning heavy on his shoulders. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The river was showing him not the future, but the desires that lurked in his heart, the deepest, most hidden longings that could easily lead him astray if he allowed them to take hold. His heart pounded, torn between the desire to believe and the knowledge that what he saw was nothing more than a trick. The vision of himself, powerful, loved, fulfilled, beckoned to him, its pull almost too strong to resist. But somewhere, deep inside, he felt the cold grip of truth. This was the illusion. The river was testing him, trying to lure him into believing in a reality that was never meant to be his. With a shuddering breath, Arlen pulled his hand away from the water, the reflection in the river dissolving into silver ripples. The images vanished, leaving nothing but the cold, silent surface once more. His heart ached with the loss of the visions, but his mind was clear. The illusion had been strong, seductive, but he had resisted. The dragon stirred, its great body shifting slightly, its eyes gleaming with a quiet approval. "You have seen through the illusions," it rumbled. "But not all are so wise. The river's power is not in the future it shows, but in the desires it reveals. Only those who can see beyond their own longings are worthy to proceed." Arlen exhaled, his body heavy with the weight of what he had just endured. The river had tested his will, his ability to see through the lies that his own heart had conjured. But he had passed. The dragon's voice was softer now, though no less powerful. "You have passed the second test, but the river has not yet revealed all it has to show. Prepare yourself, for the final trial awaits." Arlen stood, the cold air biting at his skin, the river's shimmering surface now a distant echo of the illusions it had shown him. His heart was still, but his mind was sharp. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. He had come too far to turn back now. The night around Arlen thickened, the shadows of the forest pulling closer as if they too watched and waited. The dragon had not moved, its golden eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that felt like a weight on his chest. The river, which had moments before been a deceptive mirror of illusions, now flowed quietly, its surface calm but teeming with unspoken power. Arlen stood at the edge, the last vestiges of the illusions still echoing faintly in his mind. But the river no longer whispered promises. It was silent, expectant. The dragon's voice, low and rumbling, broke the stillness. "You have passed the trial of fear, and you have seen through the illusions of desire. But now, the river demands a final test." Arlen's breath was steady, but his heart felt heavier than ever. He had known this moment would come. He had felt its presence lurking in the distance since the moment he set foot on the path to the river. But now, standing on the precipice of the unknown, the weight of it crushed against him like an invisible force. "The river shows only to those who are willing to give," the dragon continued, its voice filled with a deep, ancient gravity. "If you seek to know the future, you must sacrifice something of yourself." The cold truth of the words settled over him like a shroud. Sacrifice. He had known the journey would be perilous, but this was different. The future was no gift, and the river demanded payment, in the only currency that mattered, the soul. Arlen swallowed, his throat dry, his mind racing as the gravity of the moment descended upon him. What would the river take? What part of him would be lost forever in exchange for the knowledge he sought? He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but the reality was colder, sharper, more daunting than he had ever dreamed. The dragon shifted, the sound of its scales moving like the rustle of distant thunder. You must choose, traveler. The river does not take blindly. It waits for you to offer. The river's surface shimmered again, but it was no longer a mirror of his desires. Instead, it glowed faintly, almost pulsing, as if alive with an unseen force. The water itself seemed to reach toward him, beckoning him closer, and in that silent invitation, Arlen understood. This was the river's test. It would not force his hand. The decision was his. But what could he offer? His mind raced, searching for an answer. The future he sought was not a simple vision of success or triumph. He had come here seeking clarity, to know what lay ahead, to understand the path his life would take. But now, the cost felt too great. How could he sacrifice a part of himself for something that was uncertain? Something that could shift and change as easily as the river's current. The dragon watched him closely, its eyes gleaming with the wisdom of ages. The future is fluid, it said, as if reading his thoughts. The river shows only of what may come, not what will be. But even a glimpse can change everything. To see it, you must give something in return. Arlen's gaze flickered to the river, its waters glowing softly in the moonlight. He felt its pull, the deep magic that surged beneath the surface, and he knew there was no turning back. The journey had led him here for a reason. And this moment, the choice he faced now, was the crux of it all. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to still the turmoil inside him. What was he willing to lose? What part of himself could he sacrifice? The answer came not from his mind, but from his heart. It was the only answer that made sense. The fear he had faced in the trial, the fear of losing control, of falling, was not just a trial, but a truth. Control had always been his anchor, his way of holding the world together. He had clung to certainty, to knowing what lay ahead, as if it were the only way to survive. But now, standing on the edge of the unknown, he realized that certainty was an illusion. The future was not meant to be controlled. It was meant to be lived. With a steady breath, Arlen knelt once more by the river, the cold air biting at his skin. His reflection wavered in the water, and in that moment, he knew what he had to give. "I offer my certainty," he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "I give up the need to know what comes next, to control what I cannot." The river responded instantly. Its surface shimmered, and a light, a brilliant, ethereal glow, spread through the water. casting long shadows across the clearing. The dragon's eyes gleamed with approval, and for the first time, Arlen felt a weight lift from his chest, as if some unseen burden had been removed. The light from the river grew brighter, its magic humming through the air, and Arlen felt a strange sensation, as though something deep inside him was shifting, changing. The part of him that had clung so desperately to certainty, to control, was fading, slipping away into the current. For a moment, there was silence, and then the river stilled once more. Arlen stood, feeling lighter, different. The dragon spoke again, its voice softer now. You have given what was asked. The river will reveal what it chooses. The test was complete. The air around Arlen felt different now, lighter, as though the very atmosphere had shifted with the weight of his sacrifice. The river's glow had dimmed, settling into its natural, eerie shimmer. The world was still again, but the silence no longer felt oppressive. It was expectant, as if waiting for something yet to be revealed. The dragon, too, had stilled, watching him with a gaze that seemed to hold both infinite wisdom and a quiet mystery. But something in the creature's presence had changed. Arlen's thoughts swirled in the wake of his offering. He had surrendered the one thing he had clung to for so long, certainty. And yet, as he stood there, feeling the absence of that constant need to control, there was no emptiness, no hollow space left behind. Instead, there was something else, something deeper. The world around him felt fuller, as though it pulsed with a new kind of life, one he had been blind to before. The dragon's molten eyes flickered, and it stepped forward, its massive form rippling in the dim light. Its scales, which had once seemed so dark, so impenetrable, now caught the faintest hint of color, as though they reflected more than just the shadows of the forest. Arlen's breath caught as he realized the dragon's form was changing, though not in the way he might have expected. It wasn't growing or shrinking, but rather softening, its edges becoming less defined, more fluid. You see now, the dragon's voice rumbled, though it sounded different, softer, less commanding. What you thought I was, what you thought this trial was, it has never been about the future. Arlen frowned, confusion rippling through him. The dragon's golden eyes locked onto his, and he felt the weight of countless lifetimes in that gaze. His mind raced to understand, to grasp what was unfolding before him. The dragon had always been the guardian of the river, the keeper of the trials. But now, standing here in the quiet aftermath of his sacrifice, Arlen began to see the truth. This was never about control, the dragon continued, its voice almost a whisper now, though it echoed within Arlen's very bones. Nor was it about seeing the future. What you sought was never the knowledge of what is to come. The dragon's form shimmered, its edges blurring further. and Arlen could see that it was no longer the same creature that had first emerged from the shadows. The black scales, once so solid and imposing, were now translucent, as though the creature was made not of flesh and bone, but of light and shadow, of something far less tangible. Arlen took a step back, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of awe and unease. "Then what is this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What have I been seeking?" The dragon's lips curved into what might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell. "You have been seeking yourself." The words hit Arlen like a thunderclap. Myself. He wanted to deny it, to argue that he had come here for answers, for clarity about the path ahead. But deep down, a part of him had always known. The river, the trials, the dragon, they had been reflections, not of the future, but of his own inner journey. The dragon's form began to dissolve, its scales flickering with soft light, until it was little more than a shimmering outline against the darkness of the forest. Arlen's breath caught as he realized that the creature was not fading into nothingness. It was merging with the river itself, becoming one with the very waters it had guarded for so long. "You came here to see your future," the dragon's voice echoed, though its source was no longer clear. "But the future is a shadow, always shifting, always elusive. What you found instead was the truth of who you are and who you will choose to become." The shimmering outline of the dragon flowed into the river, and as it did, the waters began to glow once more, but this time with a light that felt softer, more welcoming. The sense of foreboding that had once hung over the river was gone, replaced by a calm serenity. Arlen stood at the water's edge, staring down into the glowing depths. The dragon was gone, but its presence lingered in the river, in the air, in the very ground beneath his feet. He understood now. The dragon had never been a guardian in the way he had imagined. It was not there to block the path or to protect the river's secrets. It had been a guide, a reflection of the trials that each seeker must face within themselves. The river's glow pulsed gently, as though inviting him once more to look into its depths. But this time, Arlen knew that the visions he might see were not of the future, but of the possibilities that lay within him, the choices he had yet to make. The dragon's final words echoed in his mind, a quiet reminder that the future was not a fixed thing, but something he would shape with every decision, every step forward. As the night deepened around him, Arlen knelt by the water's edge, the weight of his journey settling over him like a cloak. He had come seeking answers, and though the river had not shown him the future he had expected, it had given him something far more valuable. The future was not written in the stars or in the currents of the river. It was written in him. And for the first time in his life, Arlen felt truly free. The river's glow pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the surface, its light both gentle and powerful, as though it held within it all the secrets of the world. Arlen remained kneeling at its edge, his reflection wavering in the water, no longer sharp or defined, but blurred, as though it too was made of possibilities not yet realized. The night was quiet, the dragon's absence leaving a stillness in the air that felt almost sacred. He knew that what came next would not be a gift. The river would not simply give him what he sought without him reaching for it. The trials had shown him that. The future, if it could be seen at all, was not something to be handed over, but something to be understood, to be earned. Slowly, he extended his hand, letting his fingers hover just above the surface of the water. The light from the river flickered at his touch, as though it recognized him, as though it had been waiting for this moment as much as he had. He took a breath, steadying himself. The dragon had said that the river revealed only what it chose to show. And though Arlen had passed the trials, he was not certain of what he would see, or if he was ready for it. With a single, quiet movement, he dipped his hand into the river. The water was cool, a shock against his skin. But it was not the temperature that sent a shiver through him. As his hand broke the surface, the world around him seemed to shift, the air growing thicker, the light from the river intensifying. The water beneath his touch rippled outward in slow, deliberate waves, and with each ripple, the landscape around him began to change. Arlen blinked, trying to focus, but the forest and the night sky blurred, dissolving into something else entirely. The river no longer reflected the world as it was, but began to show him something new, something that felt both familiar and utterly unknown. The first image appeared slowly, as if rising from the depths of the water itself. At first, it was little more than a swirl of light and shadow, but as he watched, it solidified into a clear, unmistakable vision. He saw himself standing on the banks of this same river, but he was not alone. Beside him stood a figure, someone he couldn't quite make out. Their face was hidden in shadow, but there was a familiarity in their presence, something that tugged at his heart. He knew this person, though he had no memory of them. They stood together, their hands clasped, watching the river in silence. There was peace in the vision, a calm certainty that he had longed for, but had never known. Arlen's breath caught. This was not the future he had expected. There was no grand victory, no throne or crown, no dramatic end to the journey. It was simple, quiet even. And yet, there was something powerful in that simplicity. A sense of completeness that resonated deep within him. He tried to see the figure more clearly, to understand who they were, but the vision wavered, slipping away like a dream. The water rippled again, and the image changed. Now he saw a road stretching out before him, a long and winding path that led into a mist-covered horizon. The trees on either side were unfamiliar, their branches twisted and heavy with strange fruit. He saw himself walking down the path, alone this time, but with purpose. Though the road was shrouded in fog, there was no hesitation in his steps. He moved forward, his eyes fixed on something in the distance, something just out of reach. As he watched, the road forked, two paths diverging in opposite directions. One led into deeper darkness, the trees gnarled and foreboding, the shadows long and menacing. The other path was bathed in a soft golden light, the way ahead clear and inviting. But even as Arlen stood at the fork in the vision, he did not choose either path. He hesitated, glancing between them as if waiting for a sign, for something to tell him which way to go. The vision faded, the ripples in the water slowing, and Arlen was left once again staring into the shimmering surface of the river. His heart raced, the weight of what he had seen pressing heavily on him. The river had not shown him a single future. It had shown him possibilities. It had shown him that the path ahead was not set in stone, that every choice he made would shape the road he would walk. The dragon's words echoed faintly in his mind. The future is fluid, always shifting, always elusive. Arlen stood, his hand dripping with the river's cool water, his thoughts a whirl of uncertainty and resolve. The vision had left him with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The future was his to shape. The choices he made, the sacrifices he offered, the fears he faced, all of it would guide him toward the future he sought, even if that future was still wrapped in shadow. As the river's glow faded back to its normal quiet shimmer, Arlen turned his gaze to the horizon. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The river had shown him enough. The rest would be up to him. The air was colder now, a subtle chill weaving through the trees as Arlen stepped back from the river. The glow that had once bathed him in soft light had faded, leaving only the faint reflection of the moon on the water's surface. The dragon was gone, its presence nothing more than a memory. And the river, once filled with visions and illusions, was still again, as if waiting for the next seeker. Arlen stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. The trials were over, but the weight of what he had seen clung to him, heavy and unshakable. His mind replayed the images from the river, the figure beside him, the forked road, the mist that obscured the horizon. The visions had been fleeting, yet they lingered in his thoughts like whispers, urging him to reflect on their meaning. The dragon's words echoed faintly in his memory. The river reveals only what it chooses to show. But what it had shown him was not a clear answer, not a definitive glimpse of what lay ahead. It had shown him choices, possibilities, and paths that branched in every direction. There had been no singular destiny, only the reminder that the future was as fluid as the water itself. He turned away from the river. the crunch of leaves underfoot grounding him in the present moment. The forest loomed around him, vast and unknowable, yet it no longer felt as threatening as it had before. The path that had once seemed so perilous, twisting and shrouded in shadows, now felt familiar, almost comforting. It was the same path he had walked before, yet somehow it was different. Arlen's footsteps were slow, measured, as he began his journey back through the forest. The world outside the river's edge seemed distant now, as though the trials had transported him to a place beyond time, beyond the reach of ordinary life. But as he walked, the sounds of the forest gradually returned. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of night birds, the faint sigh of wind through the branches. The path wound ahead of him, and though it was dark, Arlen felt no fear. The trials had stripped away the illusions he had once carried with him, the need for certainty, the fear of the unknown. He had looked into the heart of the river and seen something deeper than the future. He had seen himself. The visions had not been simple. They had not promised him greatness, nor had they offered a clear path to follow. But that was their gift. They had shown him the truth that lay within. The truth that the future was not something to be foretold or controlled. It was something to be shaped, step by step, moment by moment, with every decision he made. And now, as he walked through the forest, Arlen knew that his journey was not about finding the right path. It was about choosing it. The trees parted, and the clearing where he had first entered the forest came into view. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light over the world. And for a moment, Arlen stood at the edge of the clearing, looking back at the forest behind him. He could still feel the presence of the river, distant now, but lingering like a quiet hum at the edges of his awareness. It had changed him. He was not the same man who had ventured into the forest in search of answers. But the future was not a mystery to be solved. It was an unfolding, a slow and deliberate process, shaped by the choices he made in the present. And now, as he stood on the threshold of that future, Arlen felt a deep sense of peace. He stepped into the clearing, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The village he had left behind lay somewhere beyond the hills, distant but reachable. The world he had known still waited for him, unchanged, but Arlen knew he would return to it with new eyes. He began to walk again, his pace steady and sure. The visions of the river stayed with him, not as burdens, but as guides, reminding him that the road ahead was his to walk. He had faced the trials, surrendered his need for certainty, and in doing so, had found something far more valuable. As the forest receded into the distance, Arlen's mind wandered back to the figure he had seen in the vision, standing beside him by the river, their hand in his. He didn't know who they were, or if they were real, but the feeling the vision had given him, the sense of connection, of peace, remained, a promise of something yet to come. The night deepened, the stars bright above him, and as Arlen moved forward, the weight of the journey lightened with every step. The dragon, the river, the trials, they were part of him now, woven into the fabric of who he had become. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, Arlen walked it with quiet resolve, knowing that the future was not something he had to see or control. It was something he would create. The night sky stretched above Arlen like a great tapestry, dark and endless, with stars scattered like distant embers in a fire long forgotten. His footsteps were soundless now, the forest behind him fading into shadow as he moved forward, away from the river that had shown him so much and yet so little. The world beyond the trees was quiet, a stillness that seemed to mirror the silence within him, as if everything waited for the dawn, for the next choice, the next step. He knew that the path before him would not be simple. The visions had shown him only fragments, glimpses of what could be, but nothing certain. And yet, Arlen felt no fear, no hesitation. There was a calmness within him, a strange acceptance that the future was not something he needed to grasp with desperate hands. The river had taught him that much. What he had once sought as certainty had dissolved into something deeper, something more elusive. Trust in the unknown. As he crossed the clearing, the faint light of the village appeared in the distance, flickering through the trees like a distant star. And perhaps, in some way, no time had. The river existed outside of such boundaries, its currents carrying not hours or days, but possibilities, endless and ever-flowing. Arlen's mind drifted back to the dragon, the ancient being who had guarded the river with such quiet intensity. He could still feel the weight of the dragon's gaze, those molten gold eyes that had seen through him, stripping away the layers of fear and desire, until only the truth remained. The dragon had not been a barrier, but a guide, a keeper of balance between what was sought and what was given. The river will reveal what it chooses, the dragon had said, and it had. But the revelation had not been what Arlen expected. It had shown him that the future was not a promise, but a possibility. Something shaped not by visions, but by the choices he made. The sacrifice he had given, his need for certainty, had opened his eyes to a truth far more profound. The path ahead, like the river itself, was fluid. Arlen paused, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring out at the village, the place where his journey had begun. He could still feel the weight of the visions, the figure who had stood beside him, the forked road that stretched into the mist. They were not just images. They were reflections of what could be shaped by his decisions, his actions. The road had split, and he had not chosen either path in the vision, but that choice lay ahead of him now, in the real world, with every step he took. A breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of earth and pine, a reminder of the forest he had left behind. But the river was still with him, its current flowing quietly through his thoughts, reminding him that the journey was far from over. The dragon had faded, the trials had passed, but the choices, the real choices, had only just begun. He looked down at his hands, remembering the moment he had touched the river, the way it had pulsed with light, with possibility. The water had felt both cool and warm, both real and unreal, like something that existed in the space between worlds. And perhaps that was the truth of the river. It existed in the space between what is and what could be, between past and future, between certainty and doubt. Arlen smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and took a deep breath. The road ahead was uncertain, yes, but it was also full of promise. The village would welcome him back, unchanged, but Arlen himself had changed. The river had shown him not the future, but the way forward, and with that knowledge came a peace he had never known before. He stepped into the clearing, leaving behind the forest, the dragon, the trials. But the river remained with him, its presence a quiet hum in the background of his thoughts, reminding him that the future was not something to be feared. It was something to be lived, to be shaped, one moment at a time. As Arlen walked toward the village, the stars above him shimmered in the dark sky. Their light reflected faintly in his eyes. The river flowed on, far behind him now, hidden deep in the forest, waiting for the next seeker, the next soul brave enough to face its currents. And though the river's waters had stilled, its current was endless, ever moving, ever changing, like the future itself. The journey was not over. It had only just begun.